Hello, my name is Tristan Sanabria, and today I'm going to be presenting Becoming John F. Kennedy, a biography on who I believe to be the most significant figure in history, in U.S. history to be precise, which is certainly a legacy to remember. I'm going to be starting off with his early life. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, also known as Jack by his family, was one of 9 children. He was born in Brooklyn, Massachusetts on May 29, 1917. When Jack was 3 years old, he was diagnosed with scarlet fever, which caused great concern for his father, Joseph Patrick Kennedy. Despite ongoing health struggles, Jack recovered, though he remained prone to the ailments. His father even joked about a mosquito that dared to bite him. With a drop of that blood, the mosquito was almost sure to die. Jack's father swore to himself that he'd make $1,000,000 by the age of 35. Because of this, Jack could enjoy a comfortable life. Jack was very popular and had many friends at Choate, a boarding school in Connecticut. He played sports, enjoyed reading, and his friend Lean Billings remembers how unusual it was that Jack had a daily subscription to the New York Times. Jack graduated from Choate and entered Harvard in 1935, where his brother Joe, already a student, like Joe, Jack played football. He ruptured his disc, unfortunately, though, during a game in his spine, which continued to bother him for the rest of his life. Navy. Joe and Jack were both part of the Navy. Jack was promoted to lieutenant and posted to the South Pacific as a commanding officer of a PT boat. During the night of 1943, a Japanese destroyer charged directly towards them when they were on their reconnaissance. The larger Japanese warship proceeded to ram Kennedy's boat, cutting the boat in half. Kennedy was thrown violently back against the cockpit, and again he injured his back. The water began to combust into flames with the ignition of the oil. Patrick Mahoon, one of the crew members, got burned badly. Lieutenant Kennedy then took his men to an island several miles away. Although he was wounded, Lieutenant Kennedy dragged Patrick Mahoon to shore, which was by the strap of his life jacket. Jack was later honored the Navy and Marines Corps Medal. This is an image of his squadron which is a training squadron called the Motor Torpedo Squadron 4. Political career. With the war over and his brother Joe passed away from a tragic plane crash, Jack's life changed. He considered becoming a teacher, or maybe a writer, but Jack's father convinced him to run for Congress in Massachusetts' 11th Congressional District, where he won in 1946. John F. Kennedy served 3 terms in the House of Representatives on the Democratic bill, and in 1952 he was elected to the U.S. Senate. Kennedy was making a name for himself, and in 1956 he was nearly selected to run for vice president, which he then decided to run for president because of that in the next election. Personal relationships. Not long after being elected senator, Kennedy, now 36, married 24-year-old Jacqueline Bolivar, a writer from the Washington Times-Herald. Eventually, Senator Kennedy began to bother him again, unfortunately, and he had to be given 2 serious operations. While recovering, Kennedy wrote a book called Profiles in Courage about U.S. senators who risked their careers to fight for what they believed in. In 1957, his work was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for biography. The same year, the Kennedys' first child, Caroline, was born. John Jr. followed just before Kennedy has his presidential inauguration. The President Kennedy. On July 13, 1960, the Democratic Party nominated him as candidate for president. Kennedy asked Lyndon B. Johnson, a senator from Texas, to run for vice president with him. The general election of November 8, 1960 was described as the first modern presidential campaign. This was because it was broadcasted on television and had a debate between 2 presidents. Kennedy defeated Republican Vice President Richard Nixon in a very close race. At 43, Kennedy was the 35th president, the youngest man to ever be elected office, and the first Catholic president. In his inaugural speech, Kennedy spoke of the need for Americans to be active citizens. He said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." President Kennedy was probably the busiest man in the country, but he still found time to laugh and play with his kids. However, he had also many worries. There was a deep suspicion between the United States and the Soviet Union that resulted from threats of war. never actually shooting. This Cold War, unlike any other war the world has seen, was a struggle between the Soviet Union communist system and the government of the United States democratic system. Because of this, they distrusted each other. They each spent large sums of money building up nuclear weapons, creating the real possibility of nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Cuban Missile Crisis was that just situation. During the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, U.S. U-2 spy planes discovered missiles installation sites in Cuba. They were being supplied by the Soviets. Kennedy demanded the immediate removal of the missiles. The danger was that if the Soviets refused, the United States would be forced to bomb the missile sites and provoke nuclear attack between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The Soviet leader Khrushchev initially denied the presence of missiles in Cuba. A standoff ensued where the world held its breath as the war seemed imminent. However, equally fearful of nuclear war, Khrushchev engaged in negotiations with Kennedy, and ultimately the crisis was averted. Kennedy was widely praised for his statesmanship. Civil rights.
In his home life, the president had to face numerous important issues. The worst of them all was racial discrimination. The landmark Supreme Court case, Brown versus the Board of Education, resulted in the decision to desegregate public schools in the U.S. in 1954. However, this law was not followed in many schools, especially those in southern parts of the country. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the speakers of the civil rights movement, where thousands of Americans of all races and backgrounds joined together to protest peacefully for this injustice. Some civil rights leaders did not even believe that Kennedy was sufficiently sympathetic of this cause. The president thought the only thing blacks could achieve by demonstrating was the enrage of white-dominated Congress and ensured no civil rights laws were passed. Kennedy decided on June 11, 1963 that it was high time to put measures in action. He submitted a new Civil Rights Act to Congress and also took to television appealing to Americans to rid society of racism. He said 100 years of delay has passed since President Lincoln freed slaves. Yet to heirs, their grandsons are not fully free. He emphasized that he meant that the American people of all colors should have a good life in the United States.
The race for space, one of my favorite times in history. The Soviets were in competition with the United States for conquering of space. Concerned with dangers of Soviets' technological superiority, Kennedy asked Congress to approve more than $22 billion for Project Apollo, whose goal was landing American man on the moon before the decade's end. Partially driven by his admiration for science, Kennedy gave a phenomenal speech discussing America's goal for the moon.
I created an animation of John F. Kennedy's moon speech, and I'd like to present it to you.
We meet in an hour of change and challenge, in a decade of hope and fear, in an age of both knowledge and ignorance. The greater our knowledge increases, the greater our ignorance unfolds. No man can fully grasp how far and how fast we have come. But condense, if you will, the 50,000 years of man's recorded history in a time span of but a half a century. Stated in these terms, we know very little about the first 40 years, except at the end of them, advanced man had learned to use the skins of animals to cover them. Then about 10 years ago, under this standard, man emerged from his caves to construct other kinds of shelter. Only 5 years ago, man learned to write and use a cart with wheels. Christianity began less than 2 years ago. The printing press came this year. And then less than 2 months ago, during this whole 50-year span of human history, the steam engine provided a new source of power. Newton explored the meaning of gravity. Last month, electric lights and telephones and automobiles and airplanes became available. Only last week did we develop penicillin and television and nuclear power. This is a breathtaking pace, and such a pace cannot help but create new ills as it dispels old. If this capsule history of our progress teaches us anything, It is that man in his quest for knowledge and progress is determined and cannot be deterred. But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked.
Assassination and legacy.
November 22nd, 1963, Kennedy was in Texas to give a political speech. As he waved bye to the crowds passing in the streets in Dallas, 3 shots were fired. Kennedy was seriously wounded and dead not long after. A few hours afterwards, the police arrested Lee Harvey Oswald and charged him with murder. John didn't get to see man touch the moon. Kennedy's death caused great sadness among all Americans. Most of the people still remembered exactly where they were when they heard the news of his assassination. The president's funeral was packed with hundreds of thousands in Washington, with millions watching worldwide on TV. In the end, like most leaders, John Kennedy was not infallible, yet he always looked forward to the future. He believed that people could solve their issues if they left their interests behind and put their country's interests first. Thank you.